Okay, why don't we get started? A very abbreviated introduction because we have a kind of abbreviated city forum event today. Anyway, city forum is the community regional planning colloquium series that we run throughout the year. We normally have 5 or 6, usually every other week. A city forum events on Friday between noon and 1:30 usually. We get national speakers, we get speakers from Sciara, the School of Architecture from around campus. We sometimes have community members give a city forum presentation. And this year we had 2 students that did city forum presentations on their research and activities. It's a really nice place to come on a Friday afternoon, always a free lunch. And it's a way to really sort of engage with different sort of planning issues and planning topics. So today we just had an hour, so we have to leave right before 1 to march over to another event. But today it's my pleasure to sort of, today we're really just sort of profiling some really interesting research that our faculty members are doing, sort of cutting edge research in planning field. So today we have 2 of our faculty members who you've met this morning. We have Alex Karner, who's really going to talk about this process of participatory budgeting, where the community and the public really has significant influence on making resource allocation decisions or budgeting decisions. And then second, we have Dr. Claudia and Sciara, who is going to talk about sort of regional land use transportation strategies, sort of from the perspective of governance. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Karner and enjoy.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I'm going to just jump in because we don't have very much time, and I want to make sure that Gian Claudia also has enough time to present her work. I'm going to be presenting on a paper that is basically complete. You know, sometimes faculty present on work in progress. This is not work in progress. So if you have really hard-hitting comments, I can't really incorporate them into the paper at this point, but maybe I can do a second version. It's a paper that I worked on with some of my colleagues. I mentioned in my presentation earlier that I often do work with community advocates, and so one of the co-authors on the paper is a civil rights attorney that I've worked with for a number of years in the Bay Area. Okay, so I'm going to start just by framing some of the work that I do kind of in general. I mentioned earlier that I study transportation equity and transportation justice. So I'm interested in thinking about whether the distribution of benefits and burdens that come from transportation infrastructure decisions are fair, right? And so I draw a lot on civil rights law, like Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, an executive order that President Clinton signed in 1994 called 12898, and related policies enacted by Department of Transportation agencies. So the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Highway Administration have various guidance that they promulgate and send off to their grantee organizations to ensure that they're thinking about fairness and justice in their decision making. Despite this fact of having a whole kind of legal and regulatory framework, we still don't really seem to be achieving transportation equity, right? We can look out in the world, we can see that there are people that don't have access to cars who are severely disadvantaged in labor markets. We can look within users of public transit systems and see that there are differences in the modes and level of service and quality of service that they have available. And in general, just having access to transportation seems like it's super important for allowing folks to achieve, to lead a meaningful life, right? To do the things that they want to do, and not everybody has that. So I'm kind of thinking about why this is. And there are a couple ways that we can think about achieving transportation equity. A lot of the things that happen in transportation planning are on the left side of this figure here. They have to do with a quantitative performance assessment. So an agency runs some big simulation model. They look at outcomes across different demographic groups, and they show that, in 30 years, everything is fine, right? There's no inequitable outcomes. It's all going to be great. My work for years has kind of dug into the data, models, and methods that underlie those types of quantitative performance assessments, and have exposed various flaws within them. And so I have some hope that if we did a better job at just thinking a little bit harder, using some better data and using different methods, we might do a better job at quantitative performance assessment. I'm not necessarily holding my breath that that is actually going to come to pass. So there is another way that we can also try to achieve transportation equity that doesn't have anything to do with models, simulation, data, and that's public engagement. Okay, so people participating in the planning process to articulate their needs, right? Advocating for those transportation investments or those plans that they think will mitigate conditions of transportation inequity. Okay, so, but you might say, Dr. Karner, public engagement is not a panacea, right? We know that there are different levels of public engagement, different qualities of public engagement processes. So when you come to planning school, you'll read this paper by Sherry Arnstein, the most cited planning article of all time, called A Ladder of Citizen Participation, where she goes in, she was writing in the 60s, and she categorizes different public involvement schemes according to where they fall on this ladder. So lower rungs on the ladder are characterized more by public engagement that is not actually public engagement, right? It's kind of masquerading as public engagement. It's just one-way transmission of information from decision makers to the public. As we move up some of the rungs, maybe key citizens are put onto decision-making bodies, but they don't really have a say in how decisions are being made. But as we get to the higher rungs, Arnstein says that we can achieve significant social reform by allowing what she calls have-not citizens. So today we might refer to them as marginalized populations, thinking about low-income communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, single-parent households, older adults, et cetera. If we achieve public engagement processes that get at those higher rungs, then citizens will actually have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And so there will be this kind of transfer of power from elites to regular folks, right? So that's what Arnstein was kind of all about. So we fast forward to now, we can see that we don't have very many good examples to point to that achieve very high Arnstein rungs. So this is a quote from a paper by a couple of influential public engagement researchers writing in 2004. And I would argue that not much has changed, right? They say that legally required methods of public participation do not work. They do not achieve genuine participation. They don't satisfy folks that they're being heard. They don't improve decisions, and they don't incorporate a broad spectrum of the public, okay? So when we look out at public engagement that happens in transportation, in land use planning, in environmental decision making across the board, right, regulatory decisions, there seems to be an emphasis on legal compliance. So agencies really only want to do the amount of public engagement they need to kind of check a box, right? They don't want to get sued, but they don't want to do so much that they actually have to change the decisions that they were going to make already. There are some examples of more advanced public engagement practices in the planning literature, but they often rely on extraordinary conditions for success. So long timelines, consensus building, plenty of face-to-face contact. And we could have a debate about whether those sort of collaborative planning models can actually be effective in the conditions under which they can be effective. But we were interested in thinking about, okay, well, how can we get up the rungs of Arnstein's ladder relatively quickly? And so my co-authors and I we had known about this idea of participatory budgeting, where regular residents are actually able to, as Michael said, kind of vote to allocate some share of a municipal budget at some geographic scale, right? It's usually local governments, but in principle it could be at higher geographic levels as well. And so we thought that this was a nice way to kind of get up the ladder, right? Because you're giving regular citizens, residents of a place, actual decision-making power through a democratic vote, right? So they will be able to, by definition, shape the outcomes of a particular plan. And you're not going to be in a situation where it's this kind of one-way information flow or just kind of performative public engagement. So just a little background on PB. It started up in Brazil in the late 80s. So Brazil was coming out of a dictatorship at that time. And the Workers' Party was the kind of largest political party, and they were interested in bringing, kind of re-enfranchising a population that had been disenfranchised over an extended period of time. And they thought, well, you know, what we could do is have them actually participate in making our local budgeting decisions. And it turns out that it worked pretty well. So there's been a ton of research on participatory budgeting and the positive effects that come from it, both at the kind of individual level where people report greater trust in government, feelings of transparency and a kind of deeper political engagement, but also in terms of material outcomes. So things like more affordable housing, higher density of sewer connections, better access to clean water. So it seems like it works pretty well, and it gets over this limitation of public engagement that we find in the United States, often where we do public engagement, but we're kind of at low Arnstein rungs. It's not really affecting outcomes. Well, PB ensures that it will affect outcomes. So we have thousands of PB efforts that are ongoing or completed across 5 continents, according to the most recent characteristics. So we wanted to go in, we're looking at PB, we wanted to create a consistent definition of what we refer to as strong participatory budgeting. So we had 4 characteristics that we identified. The first one has to do with process design, how the process is actually, the kind of rules for how the process is going to run, and how control is delegated. So in order to be a strong participatory budgeting process, whatever jurisdiction, level of government that has the funds should make a clear and upfront commitment to allocate those funds through a community vote. And the community members themselves should actually write the rules of the process. So looking at things like who is eligible to vote, right? Because you can imagine different characteristics that would allow folks to vote. The one that I'm going to show was if you lived or worked or owned property in a particular area, but you can imagine others. The second one is the kind of quality of outreach and support for participation. And so this really has to do with targeting and engaging with folks who are typically marginalized from planning processes, from civic life more generally. This often requires multiple contacts and actually getting out to people in person, not relying on online outreach. The third one has to do with operating funds. So in addition to the overall budget that's being allocated, you need money and staff to actually run the participatory budgeting meetings, tally votes, provide technical assistance for participants. So that's pretty important. And then finally, the size of the overall budget and what the budget could be used for. Okay, so this is how we're kind of thinking about assessing whether a given participatory budgeting effort is strong. And then linking this back to Arnstein's ladder, I mentioned already that higher Arnstein rungs are characterized by the shift in kind of decision-making power. And participatory budgeting seems to embody those high rungs. But when we look at North American efforts, it seems like the people that actually come out and participate are largely white and affluent, right? So they're not achieving that Arnsteinian ideal of the have-not members of the society achieving or sharing in the benefits of the affluent society. And the outcomes in North America kind of contrast with the Brazilian PB experience, right, where there was kind of broad-based social movements that grew up in concert with the Workers' Party and were able to participate. So we were kind of interested in this difference between North American and Brazilian PB implementation. And so our question is, or one key question we were interested in is, can we achieve high rungs on Arnstein's ladder, right? So we're achieving this kind of decision-making authority taken over by regular folks, but we actually don't achieve significant social reform. And is that, how do we need to be thinking about public engagement efforts so that we actually achieve this ideal, right? If we can have what Arnstein would categorize as sort of delegated power, citizen control, but we still don't get her desired outcomes, like what does that mean? So we looked at a couple different examples, newer perspectives on social change, largely drawn from the labor movement. So I've got a couple books here that we use pretty heavily. One is by Jane McAlevey, who's a longtime labor organizer. She has this book that came out in 2016 called No Shortcuts, and then an earlier book by Parker and Gruhl. But there are these ideas in the labor movement where they talk about social change and they have sort of a different hierarchy, right? So it's kind of similar to Arnstein in some sense, but somewhat different. So Jane McAlevey, she talks about 3 different models of social change. And she talks about the kind of lowest model is the advocacy model, and the sort of most, the one that she supports most fervently is the organizing model. And for her, she's looking at organized labor mostly. In an advocacy model, you have staff who largely drive a particular effort. Okay, so hired staff, consultants, pollsters, those are the people that are kind of driving whatever campaign you're engaging in and trying to move it forward. Stepping up one level is a mobilizing model where you don't only have staff, it's still largely staff-led, but you have a couple kind of telegenic workers who come in and try to participate. At the very highest level, you have an organizing model where the workers are kind of the source of the change, rank and file workers. And the focus is not on staff, but identifying organic leaders within the rank and file and then elevating them to positions of power. And the focus is really on continuously growing the base of workers who are invested in a particular effort. So if it's a drive to organize a union or to get concessions from an employer, you're not just focusing on the people who are already in the union, you're trying to consistently expand the base. And this, it's not new necessarily. So the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 1930s was basically using an organizing model. But a lot of labor researchers are concerned with this kind of decline in union density that we've seen since the 70s and 80s. And McAlevey attributes that decline to a declining emphasis on the organizing model and more emphasis on mobilizing. So we want to bring this kind of organizing model back. So we put it in conversation with Arnstein's ladder. So I've got Arnstein's ladder on the left, and then this kind of three-tiered model from the labor literature on the right. And you can see the advocacy model is kind of consistent with non-participation, right? So the people who are supposed to be kind of taking control of a process are only being represented by advocates. They don't have any direct say. At the mobilizing level, certain members are brought in to participate in certain bodies. And then at the highest level here, Arnstein's kind of citizen control, there's some overlap with an organizing model, but we see the organizing model going even further, right? This emphasis on building a broad base of support, on identifying organic leaders, and elevating those folks to positions of power. There's no equivalent on Arnstein's ladder. So this is one way that we're thinking about, okay, we have Arnstein's ladder, we think we're achieving high rungs, but we're not seeing this significant social reform. Here's one reason why it could be the case, right? We're not seeing organizations who are running PB in North America engaging in these types of efforts, but the Brazilian folks in large part were. So that brings us to the effort that I studied in detail called Transform Fresno. We used a mixed methods approach, so we did some qualitative interviews, we reviewed primary and secondary sources, and then we reviewed a number of the meetings that occurred for this particular participatory effort. The impetus for Transform Fresno comes from California climate change policy. I'm not going to go into detail in the interest of time, but Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006 signed AB 32 into law, which set California on a path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. In so doing, they're raising a ton of revenue, billions and billions of dollars each year through the sale of cap-and-trade permits. And by law, some share of those permits have to go to benefit disadvantaged communities. Other laws are written to direct the allocation of those funds. One such law is AB 2722, called Transformative Climate Communities. So the TCC program was written to decide how 140 million of those cap-and-trade revenues were going to be allocated in 2016. And the bill had a provision to ensure community engagement in all phases. 70 million of those dollars, the state legislature decided we're going to go to Fresno. So Fresno is in the Central Valley of California. These are just some kind of traditional environmental justice indicators showing you that Fresno, these are the neighborhoods of downtown Chinatown and West Fresno that are highlighted in red. They have the darkest colors here. These are statewide environmental indicators, so share of folks in poverty on the right, and then an overall kind of environmental vulnerability indicator on the left. So these are some of the worst neighborhoods in the state with the worst environmental conditions and some of the highest rates of poverty. So some of the most disadvantaged areas in the state. This is where the money was going to go. So the city of Fresno reacted. They established this elite 30-person committee. They said, hey, we've got this elite committee. We're going to decide how these $70 million in funds are going to be allocated. It was led by a former mayor, Ashley Swearingen, who's kind of loathed in West Fresno, Chinatown, and downtown. And so the idea was that they were going to make all the decisions. And the initial town hall meetings were pretty contentious. So folks, we were questioning, why are elites standing in for regular folks like us. So the city kind of backtracked. They formed this thing called the Community Steering Committee. And the Community Steering Committee ended up being basically a participatory budgeting body. We talked with a lot of staff that were involved in the Community Steering Committee, and they said, one staffer said they worked their asses off to establish a legitimate democratic process. And a number of the advocates we spoke with said, yeah, this was basically going to be a participatory budget led by the CSC. So in terms of the process, folks who lived, worked, or owned property in downtown Chinatown and West Fresno were eligible to participate and vote. We found that the people who ended up participating, there were about 200 regular participants on the CSC. They were recruited largely through existing activist networks, right? There was no kind of organizing model in place to build a broad base of support in the community to continually grow numbers. The TCC process itself required greenhouse gas reductions from the projects that were funded and a specific balance of project types. So one of our participants said that the effort wasn't really a participatory budget, it was more like participatory grant writing because there were all these requirements that were in place and we had to write a grant basically that would check all these boxes for the TCC process. And the mayor and the state had final approval over the process. So remember my kind of key characteristics of strong PB, delegation of control. There was not really a strong delegation of control here. There was also a really compressed timeline. So the final guidelines were being written by the state as the folks on the Community Steering Committee were trying to select projects that they wanted to put forward for community vote. The state didn't finalize the guidelines till August. Project submissions were due September 12th. And then full proposals were due to the state in November. So a heavily compressed timeline. The staff members ended up packaging projects into 4 alternatives that the community would vote on. So this is the mix of project types that were in those 4 alternatives in 7 different project categories. So the funds that came directly from TCC, those are about 70 million, and they had to go out and find matching funding as well from other sources. The community members on the CSC did not like this. They thought that these were, again, elites kind of standing in for their voice and their experience. So they came together and put together this thing called Package 5. It was put together by approximately 20 community members. And the 5th package that the community actually put together was approved at the final CSC meeting. And there was some internal shifting around of project types. You can see that it kicked out projects related to business development. There was also some internal shifting related to the exact affordable housing projects that were funded that we can talk about if y'all are interested. Okay, so that was what happened in Fresno. We assessed it on our 4 characteristics of strong PB. We found that it kind of failed on the first category, so it didn't really delegate power up front. The process was not really designed by the community members themselves. And the 5th package wasn't super democratic, right? It came together through 20 community members as opposed to the 200 that were actually attending the meetings, and the many more who didn't ever attend a meeting at all. We found also that the people who attended the meetings weren't really representative of the community. We have some quantitative data on that score, but a lot of qualitative data from our interviewees who said, yeah, the people who are coming were the kind of people who always come to these things. Folks talked about a lack of operating funds. There wasn't a lot of time or support for folks to get technical assistance with project selection or project design. The budget was huge, so $70 million, larger than the kind of second largest participatory budget in New York, which was about 41 million in 2017. And there was a wide range of project types eligible, even though there were some constraints put on funding by the TCC process. So to sum up, it seems like Fresno clearly didn't achieve our kind of ideal of strong participatory budgeting, but it did achieve high Arnstein rungs. But we argue in the paper that even if it had kind of checked all those 4 strong PB boxes, it still probably wouldn't have resulted in social transformation. And that's because there were no kind of broad-based member-led organizations that were capable of drawing in large numbers of Fresnans who had long been excluded. So we kind of come down on the side of describing the Fresno TCC experience as achieving a kind of mobilizing model where we had kind of hand-picked advocates who were able to participate, but not anywhere near an organizing model. And then just wrapping up here, in the Fresno case, small groups, right? A few environmental justice nonprofits, a couple environmental nonprofits made a large difference in who participated. The actual control that those folks were able to exert was, they were able to vote on the budget, but there were other things going on in Fresno at the same time. This huge warehousing facility being approved in West Fresno that was going to generate a ton of truck traffic and air pollution was being approved at the same time. And also Fresno's effort, it was limited to a one-time allocation of funds. So there was no kind of ongoing effort to dedicate funds that would be allocated participatorily for the future. So didn't achieve our kind of ideals of the organizing model. So what we're thinking about now, we're thinking about like takeaways for practice, like what should planners and advocates kind of take away from this. And I think there is a need to kind of support the types of organizations that are capable of building this kind of broad-based support that could be mobilized, not just for kind of labor and union-related drives, but for environmental purposes. And when a participatory budgeting effort kind of comes up, you can't just build up a broad base of community support overnight. You have to put in the kind of work to do that organizing in advance. And so there are some examples that we're drawing on from labor, but also from environmental movements and from broader efforts at things like voter registration and more political efforts. So that's my time. Hopefully, I think I'm pretty much on time. Thanks for your attention. I don't know if we're going to take questions now or if you should just go, Jean Claudia, and then we can do. Okay, we can transfer. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Fresnans, that's the demonym, Fresnans. Yeah. That's what would you call them? I mean, Fresno. It's like Austinites. No, it's Fresnans. Good question. Yeah.
Has PB ever been tried at either like the Metropolitan or regional level?
So, I know, the short answer is I don't know. Most of the efforts that are kind of case studies in literature are like local government level, so kind of like city level. I haven't seen examples that I can't remember when it's kind of like a higher level of geography. But we're thinking about applying this model to transportation funding, for example. So you can imagine a participatory budgeting effort at a regional transportation planning organization, right? Who just peels off a share of their funds and says, we're going to allocate these funds participatorily. There's nothing about scale that makes it difficult to apply at a higher level. Yeah,
Is there any interest in seeing how these decisions made by these committees turn out, and how you can even assess something like that? Like they make the decision for themselves, but are they happy with their decision?
Yeah, for sure. I mean so a lot of the PB research does get at some of those questions, right? So there are lots of different ways you can do it. You can do like pre and post interviews, you can do pre and post surveys, and the research that is available, the findings are that people are generally happier when there is like a strong participatory budgeting process. We want to make the argument that you can't just have funds that you say are going to be allocated by community vote and call that PB. You have to meet these other criteria.
One more question.
Yeah, one more. Okay, great.
It's my understanding that part of the reason why PB was able to take off in Puerto Rico is that the Workers' Party really pushed it as one of the reforms they wanted, and that helped them get into political office. By the early 2000s, the PB process started to stall in Puerto Rico as the Workers' Party started to lose power, and when that political party shifted and the Workers' Party was no longer in power, PB became less effective. So do you consider it all like political leverage? Because that was really helpful in Puerto Rico in getting PB to take off, but it also is a double-edged sword in that the opposition party criticized PB, and it was my understanding that was what was able to allow them to take office.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Fresno, it was clear that there was kind of broad-based political support, right? The mayor was on board, the state was on board, and that was key. There wasn't really I don't think there was any kind of reactionary element that said, this is, any kind of opposition party. I think it was viewed as kind of an unbridled bid. And I'm not deeply familiar with the Brazilian case, but I do know that it's kind of falling in favor. And obviously, the political situation right now is quite different than it was in the 80s. but yeah, certainly political support for PB is important. Okay, so John Claudia, are you going to introduce Michael or no?
Okay. This is the first time I'm meeting you in person. I had just my slide this morning, courtesy of Bjorn, so it's nice to see all of you and welcome. It's really great to have you here. I'll be speaking with you today about a piece of my research that looks at a piece of legislation in the state of California that brings regional organizations into land use planning in a new way. And I'm particularly interested in studying this case because it puts the regional transportation planning organizations that I'm most interested in my research, puts them in a new and unprecedented capacity to be influential in how we develop our cities and regions through land use policy, through plans, and through development decisions. And so that's what I will be speaking with you about today. So the piece of legislation that spurs my research here is called the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act. It was passed about 10 years ago in California, and it essentially takes a regional transportation planning process and it asks the transportation planning process to begin to account for greenhouse gas emissions that are produced through trip generation as a result of more dispersed land use policies. So SB 375 asks regions to depart from conventional land use patterns and move away from the kinds of more sprawling, low-density developments that have been easy ways to accommodate population growth in metro regions, and to grow more compactly in ways that will be more conducive to bicycling, walking, more efficient for transit service provision. And it attaches this new vision for regional transportation planning to concrete targets for greenhouse gas reductions at the regional level. And asking metropolitan regions to do this is a pretty tall order. And the way I can best exemplify that is by looking at these two images from the San Diego region. On the left, you see how the San Diego region had been planning for regional growth over a 20-year plus time horizon before this new requirement came to be. And you can see that through the blue dots, the housing growth, and the purple dots, job and employment growth, that the region was really anticipating a much more dispersed form of growth to accommodate development. In order to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets through their regional transportation planning process, they had to really reconsider how they were going to grow over the long term in order to meet those greenhouse gas targets. So why is this interesting? It's interesting to me and to regional planning in general because the organizations that were asked to create these newer plans had not really done this before. This was a new responsibility to think about how to shift this needle. And so the kinds of organizations that you see represented on the bottom here, metropolitan planning organizations, it put these organizations on the hook for lowering VMT through land use and development practices. And that's not really an arena that these organizations have much authority in. So they had to create these new kinds of plans that would accommodate this new growth pattern called sustainable communities strategies. But they're non-binding. And these regional organizations can't really tell individual cities if they should approve developments or not, how they should form their general plan, where they should target growth areas for new residential subdivisions, and so forth. And they're highly dependent, so the outcomes here are highly dependent on voluntary local implementation. So I'm really interested in looking at how metropolitan planning organizations deliver on this policy because they really don't have much authority here, and yet they're tasked with a pretty monumental expectation. So a word about these organizations. Metropolitan planning organizations are perhaps one of the most ubiquitous regional planning organizations we have in the United States. They're in every metro region, or every urbanized area with a population of 50,000 people or more, and they're responsible for delivering the regional long-range transportation planning process. They're largely advisory bodies. They're not governments. They don't have the power to collect taxes. They don't have any independent revenue source. They are advisory boards comprised of local elected decision makers. They're supported by a technical staff, and they exist because the federal government requires them for the expenditure of federal transportation funds. What they do is they develop long-range transportation plans and capital projects. So they are the ones who develop kind of a capital program for the region's transportation system and sign off on that. And that enables them to bring in federal requirements regarding air quality and also for delivering public participation, some of the processes that Alex has studied and critiqued. So from the perspective of this regional planning organization, the relevant sort of focuses of SB 375 were to focus vehicle miles of travel because of its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and to achieve those changes through land use, to use changes in how communities grow and changes in the built environment, the fabric of our metro regions, make them more compact so that we could promote more sustainable growth and development. So my research questions here were partly driven by some practical concerns for the implementation of this new policy. The practical considerations were, well, if these regional organizations, these MPOs, have no way of kind of strong-arming local governments to make good land use decisions, to say, no, we're not going to accept that new greenfield housing subdivision on the outskirts with 3,000 new units. We're going to say no to that, even though it's attractive to us for some, financial reasons. And we're going to do more to bring growth and development more towards the core. MPOs could have no sway over what local governments do there, none whatsoever. Local governments would be free to continue to make bad decisions, and the regional plan would sit there, look nice on paper, and not really fulfill these greenhouse gas reduction targets. Because MPOs really were in this unusual situation, I was interested in looking at, how they were able to even keep track of changes in the built environment and changes in land use over time. So they couldn't force local governments to do anything, but were they even keeping track? Were they even following whether or not local governments were making land use decisions that would support these new VMT reducing hopefully greenhouse gas reducing regional plans? I looked at whether or not MPOs actually tracked land use and development in the region, and also wanted to know how they monitored these changes. The bigger picture really was, I was wondering, could MPOs, absent any authority to compel local governments to make smart growth, compact development, supportive kinds of land use decisions, could they potentially use information and information feedback to local governments to move the needle a little bit? Could they say, well, we can't make you do anything about this, but, based on the information we're collecting, local governments A, B, and C, you're doing really poorly, or, you're doing really well. So, in order to understand what metropolitan planning organizations were doing to actually follow local land use and development in their region, we looked very carefully at the land use component of their regional transportation plans, and understood what kinds of information they collected about land use, how they really assessed what was going on in the region. And we also spoke to the executive land use planners at each organization. We interviewed them in depth about what kind of information they got from local governments about development decisions, zoning changes, general plan amendments, and how they used this information. So, in a condensed talk, I'm going to skip to kind of some of the key takeaways. What I found was that MPOs actually, they tend to collect diverse and sometimes extensive data about land use and development in the region, but that they mostly only collect these to update the long-range plan. They're really only looking at how the region is growing so that they can formulate their next regional long-range plan. They're not really looking at it to, say, understand whether or not the plan is being implemented or to measure progress from the last plan. They're more or less kind of going through the checkbox exercises. In terms of the kind of information they receive, most regional planning organizations get some flow of regular information about local development. So they may, for instance, get regular updates from local governments about general plan amendments, or potentially a significant zoning update. And so there's a kind of smaller pieces of information that come to them on a regular basis. But many MPOs actually really struggle to get accurate, up-to-date, consistent, and comprehensive information from local governments about their development plans and practices. So that makes it a challenge for them to understand what is happening in their region and to really have a sense of whether or not local governments are moving towards this vision of a more compact region that is less automobile dependent. From a bigger picture perspective, what is more striking here from my findings is that really almost none of the MPOs that we interviewed and spoke with saw it as their job or really had much interest in monitoring local land use changes or even doing some kind of assessment as to whether or not local governments were delivering on plans. This is something that they didn't want to go there. They didn't want to touch that. Land use was a highly sensitive issue. It was difficult for regional organizations to begin to tread into this terrain by formulating these sustainable community strategies and VMT reducing land use plans. And they were very sensitive about this. They felt that if they did anything to suggest they were policing local governments, that the local governments would push back. Further, few MPOs, a very small number really, did much outside of their required 4-year planning cycle to get information on a regular basis. So they were really not keyed into this idea of trying to measure progress. There's a lot I could tell you about the data and the kinds of things, information they collected or wanted to collect to help them feel like they could measure progress more accurately. But I want to cut to more of some of the findings that relate to the capacity of these organizations to actually engage in monitoring local land use and development. And what I found here is that I could identify some patterns in the regional organizations that did a better job at tracking land use and development practices than others. So I, after speaking with and inventorying all of the kinds of mechanisms that these organizations use to find out about local land use and development in their region, I categorized them by how frequently they actually reached out to and got information sources from local governments, and also I categorized them by the extent of the data collection they did. So how deeply did they go? How comprehensively did they try to get updates from local governments? How comprehensive were their data? Were their data digital, or were they just paper copies? Did they do analysis of it? And not too surprisingly, the smallest and least urban regions really had the hardest time doing any kind of monitoring on this policy. The largest and most urban ones tended to be more proactive about getting information about land use, and some of them even went so far as to have kind of dashboards. They put dashboards up on their websites to kind of show how well local governments were performing in different dimensions. And I want to close here with some observations about their ability to do land use tracking and what this means for the prospect for these advisory regional planning entities to be influential in the land use and development domain. Some of them had some they did internal tracking of development in the region. So in other words, they compiled their own internal databases, and they would keep track of local developments, how many units were being added, where development was going, whether or not this new development was compliant or would support the plan. Some of them did some internal tracking, and that was notable. They were able to use some of the planning processes for the development of the regional transportation plan to get information from local governments as well. So through these basic plan development meetings, they got additional information. Again, some of the more sophisticated ones did develop maybe tracking systems and online dashboards that showed how well local governments were performing. And perhaps these last two bullet points were what I think as the more interesting takeaways, in that the regional organizations that seemed to have the biggest handle on what was happening at the local level in terms of development were the ones that were fulfilling the role not only of a metropolitan transportation planning organization, but also doing other jobs. So where regional organizations were nested together with other functions. Now you can't really read the names of the organizations on the left or the kinds of responsibilities that they have on top, but if you pay attention to the pattern of red and green in the columns, you can see that where green boxes are checked, these MPOs, which are listed in the rows going down, where multiple green boxes are checked, these organizations are doing more than just transportation planning. They are responsible for potentially administering a local sales tax, or they may have management responsibilities for regional airports, or they may have a responsibility under state environmental law to do environmental reviews. And the more involved that these regional organizations were in other aspects of planning and development in the region, the more likely they were to really understand what was happening and to be able to track this. And what this suggests really for future efforts for trying to bring what have been more transportation-focused planning organizations into the world of land use and development, which is critically important for feeding transportation demand and transportation outcomes. If we want to bring these organizations into the land use domain, to the extent that they are large and robust organizations, again, thinking about the bigger ones that did the better job because they had the resources, and to the extent that they are already engaged in a number of other development-related activities in the region, they'll be more successful. So that's where I will conclude.
Okay, I think we have to sort of mobilize and go. Maybe one question real quick?
Sure.
We have to go.
Okay. Yes, well, go ahead.
You mentioned the dashboards.
Yes.
Where does the information come from? Like, who's collecting, how many units, like, is that permitting?
Yes, so, yeah, these regional organizations, they will go out to all of the local governments in their region and say, how many building permits have you issued? How many certificates of occupancy? So you can imagine, the more local governments there are in the region, the harder it is to actually to do all of that. If you're interested in the dashboard, a good example is the vital signs dashboard. You can Google that.